So what I'd like to do today is share a scientific paper I was looking at on DMT. So DMT is the active ingredient in ayahuasca. So ayahuasca is, I think, a kind of cactus that is used by certain Native American tribes as like part of their religious ceremonies and as part of like spiritual journeys and things like that. So I do not advocate for the use of any psychedelics without medical supervision or the appropriate supervision. I suppose if it's part of a religious tradition that you're a part of and there are people in your religious tradition that know what they're doing, that's probably okay too. But generally speaking, as a medical doctor, I do not advocate for the usage of any of this stuff. So let's take a quick look at the paper and see what they sort of see, okay? So an encounter with the other, a thematic and content analysis of DMT experiences from a naturalistic field study. So in this study, what they did is they took DMT, or they didn't take DMT. They took 36 people who used DMT, and they started asking them questions like, what was your experience? What was it like? What happened to you? Things like that. So they did content and thematic analysis, right? So let's take a quick look at that. Ooh, so bright. Okay. So N-dimethyltryptamine, or tryptamine, is an endogenous serotonergic psychedelic capable of producing radical shifts in conscious experience. So if memory serves, it activates serotonin receptor 5-HT2A. So there's like certain things associated with that. Increasing trends in its use, as well as new trials administering DMT to patients, indicating the growing importance of a thorough elucidation of the qualitative content over and above structure which the drug occasions. This is particularly in light of the hyper-real, otherworldly, and often ontologically challenging yet potentially transformative nature of the experience, not least encounters with apparently non-self social agents. Laboratory studies have been limited by clinical setting and lacking qualitative analyses of the experiential content, while online surveys limitations lie in retrospective design, uncontrolled use, and both of which not guaranteeing breakthrough experiences. So screened, healthy, anonymized, and experienced DMT users were observed during their non-clinical use of the drug at home. And then in-depth semi-structured interviews on 36 people, okay? So what they essentially did was, 36 post-DMT experience interviews with mostly Caucasian, 80%, males, 8 females. So this is 28 to 8 in terms of gender ratio. Of average 37 years were predominantly inductively coded, okay? The first overarching category comprised the encounter with other beings, 94% of reports. So this is with 34 of the 36 people talked about encountering otherworldly beings. And so this is kind of interesting, right? So then like encompassing superordinate themes, including the entity's role, appearance, demeanor, communication, and interaction, while the second overarching category comprised of experiences of emerging into other worlds, 100% of reports. Many further mid-level themes and sub-themes also illuminate the rich content of the DMT experience. Okay? So basically what this study did is it took experienced DMT users, I'm not sure exactly what that means. I'm sure they define it. And they asked them, like, what happens when you use DMT? And 34 out of 36 were like, we encounter otherworldly beings. And 100% were like, we visit other worlds. So what the hell does that actually mean? Right? Like, what's going on here? So let's like run through a couple of options. So the first is like, let's take kind of a neurobiological approach. So like there's an argument. So here's the question that I'm basically trying to explore. Is this real? Do otherworldly beings exist? Can you travel to different planes of existence and like all this other weird stuff? Is any of that crap real? So the first thing to kind of note is that we don't really have any evidence of this stuff existing, right? We have no pictures, we have no signals, we have no way that these beings communicate with us in a verifiable, consistently reproducible answer, at least that I'm aware of. If y'all know about, transmissions from alternate universes, please let me know. We'll get to what's real in a second. So then the question is like, okay, if we don't have any like concrete evidence that this stuff actually exists, like what's going on? So there's the neurobiological hypothesis, which essentially says that this is like your brain malfunctioning, for lack of a better term. So we have these parts of our brain that interpret stimuli, and if you directly stimulate them with drugs, it'll create these kinds of artificial experiences which sort of aren't real, right? And so there's no real there. It's just our brain is kind of messed up, and it's all essentially like an illusion within our brain or within our mind. Now, I personally lean a little bit away from that explanation, so I completely agree that we have no evidence that these things exist and that they communicate with us in an objective, reliable manner. But I think this is where we start to get into amateur philosophy, which I'm sure if y'all are philosophers out there, you'll be able to explain this better than I can. But one of the things that we understand about the brain is that like it interprets stimuli and creates a reality, right? So the simplest thing to think a little bit about is that, when I look at this table and I touch this table, it feels solid to me. It looks solid to me because I can't penetrate it with my eyes. But the truth is that most of the table is like empty air, right? It's like electrons spinning in orbits. And even the force that I feel is the result of electrons. It's not actually like physical resistance. It's not like my atom is bumping against a physical barrier. I think it's like, what we consider physicality is mostly empty space. So our brain is sort of designed to interpret things. So we also see this like neurologically, that the brain can interpret things that don't exist. So phantom limb is a really good example of this. So phantom limb, sometimes people will lose a limb and then there are no nerves left there, right? Because it's gone. And yet we know that people will experience sensations in their phantom limb, unfortunately most commonly pain. And so even though your hand is gone, you feel like there's a hand there. Now this has sparked sort of this idea in the, in the spiritual realm of like, oh, you have an astral body and the astral body is still intact. That's why you can still feel things. I don't really know if I really buy into that because we sort of have neurological explanations for that, your somatosensory cortex, the map in your brain has neurons that are devoted to this part of my limb. And even if I lose this part of my limb, sometimes like signals will get sent, which get interpreted by our central signal interpretation apparatus is the existence of a limb. So we kind of know that. So which one is it? We certainly know sort of the scientific side of it, in phantom limb. There are also really cool exercises that you can do that can trick your brain into making the phantom limb pain go away. And that's the kind of thing that if there's truly an astral body, I don't know how that sort of makes sense. So, we know that the brain is capable of interpreting stimuli and sort of like makes a representation of the world. Now that's like basically what the brain does. So we don't actually see reality, right? So someone earlier was asking, what is reality? Well, like, we don't really know. So what we see is not actually real. And as a psychiatrist, like this is something that's very clear to me, is that the mind does not produce an accurate representation of reality, right? So if I have a patient who's suicidal and thinks that their family would be better off without them, that is like factually, like pretty clearly incorrect, right? So the family will even tell them, no, we'll be lost without you. We love you. Don't go anywhere. But in the mind, our mind is capable of producing these things that we call cognitive biases, which shape reality to look a particular way, which it isn't. And even when we look at things like the wavelength of light, right? So like light only looks the way it does because of the way that our photoreceptors react and the construct that our brain kind of puts together, right? So we can't I don't know that, and this is where I'm not really an expert here, but when I look at the world and I see red, it's unclear to me whether that red is real, right? It's a wavelength of light. That's really all we know. And my mind interprets it as red, right? That's what I think it is. So in general, like our mind is between us and reality. I think that we're pretty sure about. Maybe I'm wrong there. And so it's kind of weird. So like we even have weird things like, telescopes and night vision goggles. So like when if I have a telescope and I like look into like something over here, it makes it seem like the moon is like right in front of my face, right? Like I'm looking at the moon like right here. But the moon isn't actually there, right? So like it's kind of weird because the moon is like up there. So that's really where it is. And now I'm interpreting it as over here. And I essentially like use a telescope to make the moon appear closer, right? But then we kind of get the question like, okay, so like what's real there? Like, is what I see real, or is, the moon is really far away and I'm using an instrument to make this thing appear closer. And then the other thing that's kind of important, the reason that we sort of conclude that the moon is really there and that this is like a fair interpretation is because anyone who looks in the telescope will see the moon, right? Like anyone who looks in the telescope will like see the moon. So when we have a conservation of human experience, that's what we sort of call objective reality. So if we say that like, to the west is the Pacific coast and to the east is the Atlantic coast, that's true if you're in North America. So we have like a bunch of human beings that get together on some shared experience and we decide that this is reality. So then the question kind of becomes, okay, so like if that's sort of how we determine like what's real and what isn't, and there are arguments against that, I'm sure, then what's going on with this DMT stuff, right? So then this is where there's a part of me that kind of wonders, is this essentially like a telescope, right? Is this like a tool that we can use that, does it represent reality? Like sort of, or is there something real that we're picking up on, which our brain is then interpreting in a particular way, right? So we call these things beings because we don't have, this word is so hard to use, but I'm going to try to use it anyway. So we don't understand the dimension at which they exist because that's just, we're going off into left field. So that's the best word I can use, right? Oh my God, they're like alternate dimensions. Like, oh my God. No, but like literally, like what our brain does is interpret stimuli based on our understanding, right? So like our brain is a pattern generating machine. That I feel pretty confident in. So we have this encounter with this thing, and then we call it a being because we don't know what else to call it. It's the closest thing in our approximation. But then the question still remains, like, is that thing real? Is there something really out there? Or is it just like is it like a phantom limb, or is it the telescope looking at the moon? Right? That's the main question. Now, generally speaking, I'm of the mind that there is like stuff out there. I don't know how else to describe it. And that's primarily because of my experiences in meditation. Okay? So that's where like, in the absence of a substance, when you meditate for a prolonged period of time and you have like a weird experience, it sort of shapes the nature of your reality. Like it changes you. And that's what we sort of know this, some of this stuff, we know the effects of this scientifically. So we know that, for example, people who meditate on a regular basis will like be more empathic, be more compassionate. So we can see some of the outcomes that we can measure of meditation. But when you really like talk to people, like what leads to these like profound changes in compassion are like these spiritual experiences. And this is where like even William James talks about this stuff in the Varieties of Religious Experience, where he kind of talks about, religious delusions and spiritual experiences and all this kind of stuff. Like what's psychosis? What's a spiritual experience? Like, we know that human beings have these weird things that happen to them. So then the next thing to kind of think a little bit about is that, what was I going to say? The next thing to consider is that any substance tends to activate the brain, right? It doesn't actually like create new neurocircuitry. So for example, when I use cocaine, the reason it's so addictive is because it's activating circuitry that's already there. So even in the case of DMT, we know that, for example, DMT activates 5-HT2A, so a particular serotonergic receptor. So when we use a substance, it just activates the neurocircuitry that's already there, okay? So even in the case of DMT, like we know that it activates 5-HT2A. Now, this is where things get kind of interesting. So we know that, for example, opioids activate the mu receptors, right? We know that cannabinoids activate cannabinoid receptors or anandamide. So THC or marijuana activates those receptors. So we know that all these things like will activate receptors in our brain. So then the question kind of becomes, if it's just turning on something in the brain, do you need the substance at all? So this is where, I don't know that we have a clear answer, because it may be possible that DMT activates the brain in a way that it is impossible to endogenously activate the brain. I don't know. But generally speaking, I think that most things that drugs can do, we can get some kind of approximate experience ourselves, because we all have 5-HT2A receptors in our brain that get activated all the time. It's just about cultivating a particular kind of practice that activates those receptors through that practice. Now that too is a scientific statement that hasn't been borne out. We don't know if that's true. So the skeptical side, which I live with, will say like, well, we don't really know that you can activate that constellation of receptors in that way endogenously. Because it's not 5-HT2A receptors all over your brain. So DMT may, get uptaken by particular cells, may get distributed in a particular way that may not be possible to endogenously create. What I do know, though, is that, a lot of the experiences that people will describe with psychedelics are very similar to what I've experienced with meditation. The biggest difference is that in meditation, it's not as sexy, for lack of a better term. So, in terms of like encounters with otherworldly beings, it's like, it feels like really normal. It's hard to describe. So a lot of the things that I've come to understand, I'm going to say something weird that's kind of hard to describe, but so like, through meditation, I've come to understand, this is going to sound weird. I've come to understand the rhythms of the universe. And like, what the hell does that even mean? It's hard to describe. It's sort of like, like gravity. So gravity is like a thing that we all see and we're aware of and we account for, but it's not anything magnificent, right? Like, sure, it's like, when you think about it, it's amazing that all these orbits and stuff like that, but on a day-to-day basis, like gravity is like, it's gravity. So in that way, like understanding the rhythms of the universe is just sort of like, it's like gravity. It's like understanding that there is a kind of gravity in terms of a general universal force that acts in the world that you understand now when you meditate. So it's just like knowledge of gravity is the best way I can put it. And it is as simple as gravity, at least in my experience. So is it pretty cool? Sure. Is it useful? Absolutely. Is it like neat to think about? Yeah, but it's not like this weird, like, oh my God, like I understand like the rhythms of the universe, man. I don't even know what that means. It's even hard to describe because it's just sort of like you kind of, intuitively understand how gravity works. So you know that if you like pick up a rock and you drop it, it's going to fall. Like it's as simple as that. So in terms of otherworldly beings, like that too, I would sort of say is this sort of thing where like, you just kind of encounter them and they're just sort of there and they're chilling. I think it's like kind of like plant life. It's sort of like, it's kind of doing a thing. And sometimes they're pretty cool. Like, don't get me wrong, but it's not as, it's not like the way that it's portrayed in movies and that yoga hippies talk about, or people who have done drugs for that matter. So the experience seems to be much more drastic and bizarre when people use drugs.